Have you ever found a really obscure or gnarly creature in an old monster manual and used it on your players to great effect, where they had never heard of this thing before, weren't sure of its abilities and resistances and so forth, and it just absolutely landed? But then you're left asking, well, will I be able to use this creature again? Do I need to scour more ancient tomes to find something else to use against my players to get that same effect? Hi, I'm Peter, creator and lead designer of Tales from Elsewhere, and I'm the old guy on the porch shouting that I've been playing tabletop role-playing games since before you were born. And on this channel, we go into game design principles and discuss how to make ourselves better game designers, and sometimes we talk about general GM advice, like in today's video. We'll be talking about the concept of threat reprisal, the methodology of bringing monsters back for a second go at the players, and how to do that in an evocative way. So let's look at some examples from film and from some sessions that I've run, and then apply those to this gnarly creature I stumbled upon called the Forsaken Shell. So as we dive in here, let's talk a little bit about the difference between a threat introduction and a threat reprisal. Now, my buddy Scrat over at A Squirrel Plays, which is a really cool YouTube channel that I'll post a link to down below, he just did a video on the idea of threat introductions, and we have talked extensively on this subject, and he actually cites one of these sessions that I've run in that video, and it'll serve as a nice companion to this one. So check that out once you're done here as just additional context for the first half of this process. In short, threat introduction is being intentional about how you introduce a monster to the players, not just necessarily plopping it down in a box in front of them, but doing foreshadowing, some signs of its coming, and then using that to build tension before actually having the players face a creature. And this threat introduction is an important investment in our future design for the threat reprisal. We want the players to be cognizant of these tells, these signs of a creature, so that when we see them later down the road, they can be cued in. Now, after that initial encounter, this threat introduction, the players will have maybe interacted with their abilities and resistances and vulnerabilities. They'll have a better idea on how to face this creature. Even if they've lost the fight, if they had to flee, they'll now know a little something more than they did. They'll have this knowledge unlock at the player level, the actual people sitting at the table, for future reference. And again, that's an important investment for later. A great example of threat introduction would be the movie Alien. Now, the movie Alien is obviously the pinnacle of sci-fi horror, and it actually follows very closely the tomb method that is put forth in the game Mothership. The tomb method, in short, is to have a transgression, then an omen, then the manifestation, and banishment. And this maps onto the movie Alien quite nicely. The transgression is the crew going down into the alien spacecraft and fiddling with the eggs. The omen would be John Hurt's character getting the parasite on him and the strange occurrences around that. The manifestation is, of course, the chest burster bursting out of his chest and becoming an alien threat. And then finally, the banishment is when Ripley is able to eject the creature out into space, but it's not quite dead. And this acted as a great introduction to the xenomorph, to these aliens for the viewer, for us sitting in the audience. It taught us its abilities, its resistances and vulnerabilities. We learned about things like acid blood and its ability to grow really fast and the disturbing way that it reproduces. All of this is then taught to us, the viewer, and to the character Ripley, which will be used later in its reprisal. Because the movie Aliens acts as a direct threat reprisal of the xenomorph. They've done a number of things to make this reprisal interesting. It's not just Ripley once again on a ship with a single xenomorph, but rather a colony that has been overrun by xenomorphs. And we get to see how Ripley's prior knowledge and the viewer's prior knowledge becomes relevant and is rewarded throughout the film. You see, in Alien, the crew of the Nostromo had no idea what they're getting into, but the characters that go down in the Cheyenne dropship in Aliens know exactly what they're getting into, or so they think. Ripley knows the vulnerabilities of these creatures, she knows how they act and fight, and she's coming in with a bunch of people with big guns, ready for just another bug hunt. And this prior knowledge for us as viewers comes into play because now we get to see these telltale signs of these xenomorphs coming and their threat because we watched the previous film. We know that a single alien, a single xenomorph is so dangerous on their own. And knowing that now there's going to be dozens, if not hundreds of them, rewards us as a viewer for our previous knowledge. That's cool to us, and we understand the tension and danger that that represents. And just like in Alien, the characters in Alien suffer heavy casualties, with only Ripley, Michael Biehn's character, Newt, and Bishop the android in pieces surviving in the end. And they survive in large part because Ripley leveraged her previous knowledge and what she could learn now that she's encountered the alien queen to overcome all of this terror and danger. So this is what a threat reprisal is, right? This is allowing the players to leverage their prior knowledge in a way that rewards them for paying attention previously, but also can fill them with dread and tension because they now understand what that threat represents. So as you escalate things in this reprisal, that can really push forward that tension and sense of danger, recapturing some of that feeling you had when you first introduced them to the creature. Let's walk through an example of how I planned a threat introduction and threat reprisal in a campaign in my game Tales from Elsewhere. I wanted to plant the seeds of one creature in the very early parts of the campaign and then bring them back later to great effect. And I think it worked really well. So let's go through my planning process and how this played out. This campaign was a fairly linear one in which the players acted as guards for a wagon train heading out deep into the ruination to settle a new town. Scouts had located this remote and partially intact pre-calamity ruin that would be perfect for building a new settlement and expanding humanity's reach back out into the lands that were once theirs. But it was far away and full of peril to get there, so the players were going to have to go on weeks and weeks, if not months, of journeys through the land to arrive at their destination. So I wanted the Blood Oilers, one of the poster boy monsters of my game, to be shown early on so that the players could get a taste of them, and then brought them back in full swing as a reprisal later on as the capstone or climax of the campaign. So in an early scene, which Scrat talks about in his video and he actually got to play, the players are attempting to cross a dammed river. And in doing so, one of the wagons tips over and crushes an NPC, and they have to try to rescue them, and then bandits attack, and yada yada yada. But as they approached that river, I described that there were these oil slicks and weird smells coming from the river. And then after the bandits blow the dam to flood the river and try to trap the players, a blood oiler, rotten and rusty and bloated from being trapped underneath the dam, emerges and starts mercilessly slaughtering some of the bandits that just moments ago were ambushing the players. And the blood oiler is a terrifying foe even when it's on its own. And the goal here in this scene wasn't for the players to kill all the bandits and kill the blood oiler, it's actually just to escape, to get free of this river and continue on their journey. And the blood oiler is so deadly and durable that it took a lot of effort to even down one of them. But as the players watched in horror, more of these things started washing up at the head of the river from the dam that was destroyed. And so the players all get out of there, and maybe some of the bandits live and ally themselves with the players. But it is a harrowing experience for sure. And it's worth noting that the players aren't directly fighting the Blood Oilers in this scene. The Blood Oilers are acting as this hazard that is pressuring the players to leave. And they're even slightly weakened, these Oilers. They're rusty and damaged, and so they're not even at their full strength. And the players can tell that they're eroded, and that even then they act as this terrifying foe, and they hope to never see them again. And after that scene, the players continued on their adventure. The wagon train travels for weeks and weeks through the ruination, going through all sorts of other mishaps and misadventures, fighting other monsters and so forth, till eventually, finally, they reach their destination in this pre-calamity ruin and have a sigh of relief. However, there were supposed to be a handful of scouts waiting for them there, the scouts that had discovered it, but they found the town empty. So they start looking around the town, creaking open doors and looking for things, and they start to see evidence of violence having occurred. They see some spent shell casings, they see some bullet holes in the walls, but they don't find any people until they start to discover some signs. Behind the saloon bar, they'll find a severed arm still clutching the sawn-off shotgun in its hand with 2 shells spent. They'll see some pieces of cybernetics chipped off by gunfire, or they'll find some spilled oil on the ground that reeks of necrosis. And with those tells, with these signs that they've already learned, the players know the Blood Oilers have been here and taken people from it. And they know that if there are Blood Oilers nearby, they can't safely let all of these civilians settle here. Their lives are in danger. So they know they have to go track down where these Blood Oilers went, to their den, and destroy it. And this all lands because the players understood how deadly just one of these things was. And now seeing that there may be an Oiler nest nearby should fill them with dread. And the looks on their faces at the table were just great. I ran this for multiple tables, and this always landed really well. Because now they know, okay, we know what we're getting into. How are we going to do this? And just like in Aliens, now the players gear up in anticipation of this fight, using their prior knowledge to their advantage. They'll gather holy water or armor-piercing rounds, they'll get bandages together, or maybe even explosives, bundles of dynamite or gunpowder barrels, so that they could level whatever nest that these Blood Oilers have built. They'll throw them all in a donkey-pulled cart or something, and head out following the Blood Oilers' tracks. This is the same stats of the Blood Oiler, just at full hit points, basically. But now they know they'll probably face more of them. And that intensity, that dread, lands so much better because of the seeds I planted in the threat introduction. This reprisal now is glorious. And remember, it's not just about that escalation on the threat reprisal, about increasing the number of enemies. That's an important part to have a feeling of additional threat, but really it's about rewarding that previous knowledge. It's letting the players feel like they put this together this time. They saw the clues, they understand the signs, and now they plan how they'd like to take down these monsters. So let's take what we've learned so far and apply it in real time to creating a threat introduction and threat reprisal for the Forsaken Shell, which I found in Libris Mortis, this old 3.5 edition rulebook that is full of really cool undead. So first, let's just introduce ourselves to the Forsaken Shell. The Forsaken Shell is, and I quote, "Roiling and coiling, this long, slender creature snakes forward. At first, it does seem like a snake, if strangely wide and loose-skinned, but an instant later the creature is revealed for what it is, an evacuated but horribly animate humanoid skin that continues to slither onward in unmistakably aggressive manner." Now, mechanically speaking, this doesn't have a lot of exciting attacks. Basically, it will constrict around a single character and then slam them to death. It wraps itself around a player and then just basically crushes them until it dies. The really cool feature is that if it kills somebody, it can cause their skin to animate into another Forsaken Shell. So it can spread its undead curse to others by killing them. So we can use that in our planning for our introduction and our reprisal. So I think the cleanest way to do this sort of threat introduction and reprisal for the Forsaken Shell would be to just create a parallel between how it reproduces, showing the players how the Forsaken Shells come to be, and then using that later for the players to discover and create extra horror. So in the introduction, the players will stumble upon a single Forsaken Shell on its own. They'll get into a fight with it, maybe they'll take some damage, maybe it'll be tough, depending on, the challenge rating you put in relation to the party's level. But after they've destroyed the Forsaken Shell, they can then discover the grisly remains of the person that it was made from. They can see, like the desiccated, skinless corpse somewhere else in that dungeon and think, okay, that's where that came from. They're now clued in as to how this thing works. So that way later on, maybe a couple levels later, or sometime later in the adventure, or later in the dungeon even, the players could come across the corpses first. They can find all of these skinless bodies and no Forsaken Shells in their immediate vicinity. They get to then put two and two together and think, uh-oh, there's a bunch of these somewhere nearby. And you've recaptured now a lot of that tension because the players use their previous knowledge and anticipation to build tension on themselves. They then will start planning and figuring out what spells to prepare, what weapons to get out, and what consumables to use, because they know a fight is coming with several Forsaken Shells. They can even tell how many based on how many corpses. They can run these numbers as a player process, which feels really empowering and also terrifying for them. And the fight doesn't even necessarily need to be that much harder for the players, right? These Forsaken Shells could be easy for them to defeat now that they know how they work. Maybe that planning really pays off this time. Maybe they realize that the Forsaken Shells aren't particularly fast, so they get some distance when they do discover them and blast them with fireballs first. Or maybe they have a lot of holy spells or radiant damage ready to go so that when they do encounter these Forsaken Shells, they're taken down. Or maybe they prepare freedom of movement spells so that they can't be grappled as easily, right, by these creatures. It's okay if the players do feel kind of badass in that reprisal fight, because you want them to feel like they were rewarded, because they already know what the monsters can do when they have the upper hand. So it's cool for them to see what it's like when they are prepared. And now you'll note we didn't talk about like the narrative that would tie these two scenes together, that would introduce these Forsaken Shells initially, because that's an additional skill, an additional layer that you can use for immersion. But as somebody who's a big fan of action movies and martial arts movies, sometimes you can tell a complete experience that is evocative and interesting with very little narrative around it. You can do so through the fight design, through encounters, and linking them together in thematic ways, by rewarding the players for their previous knowledge of these monsters. Because good encounter design is another skill in a GM's toolbox. Being able to tell good stories, being a good listener, being a good facilitator of roleplay, all of this is part of that toolbox. And encounter design is definitely an important one, but not encounter design as a single entity, but encounter design as a series of scenes, as a series of fights, and how they'd be linked together. Like any good action movie would. There should be a flow, a connection that these fights make that the players can leverage in the fight itself, not necessarily even through roleplay. And when you're designing your own monsters, when you're homebrewing them for Dungeons & Dragons, or maybe working on your own tabletop role-playing game, building in these tells, these omens, into the monsters themselves, having that planned ahead of time as a seed for your players to utilize, goes a long way with creating interesting, evocative encounters. If the Forsaken Shell didn't have this dark reproductive ability where it can cause other skins to slough off, then it wouldn't be as easy for me, picking up the book and looking at it right now, to come up with an interesting introduction and reprisal. The creature has that in its stat block, and that's really cool, and often not common in the stat blocks of monsters. And just to reinforce how easy this template of introduction reprisal can be when a monster has something built into it, I actually picked out the Forsaken Shell 15 minutes before recording this video. I wasn't even sure what book I was going to use and what monster I was going to use when I sat down today. I just went through my library of game books and thought, I haven't looked at Libris Mortis in maybe a decade. I'll flip through it. And lo and behold, I stumbled upon the Forsaken Shell and saw its dark reproductive abilities and thought, here we go. I can easily do this now with a basic introduction and reprisal methodology. Boom, evocative sequence of fights. Well, I hope you all found that interesting. If you'd like to hear more about these sort of design discussions, the Tales from Elsewhere Patreon page has an additional video every week exclusive to patrons, where I'll review and break down additional content from the prior week's video. So if you'd like to dig into more, consider backing us on that Patreon page. All funds of the Patreon go to the creatives that are behind the scenes working on this channel and the game. It goes into editing, artwork, and so forth. So thank you to all patrons that are currently on there. You're really making all of this possible and worthwhile. And I hope to see you all next week on Tales from Elsewhere.